I would like to to begin with, well, first, to mention that this presentation is part of this year's Speakers Series organized by the MA Humanities program. I would like to thank those who were involved in the organization of this Speaker Series, and more specifically at the talk today, namely Hoi Chu, Director of the MA program, also Gillian Crozier, who is not here today, and Ernst Gebhardt, and also Amy Adam. It is a great honor for us today to welcome Dr. Colleen Derkatch. I will present a brief short biography. Dr. Colleen Derkatch is Assistant Professor in the Department of English and Vice Chair of the Research Ethics Board at Ryerson University. And she is the author of Bounding Biomedicine, Evidence and Rhetoric in the New Science of Alternative Medicine, which came out at the University of Chicago Press in 2016. The talk today is part of a larger project funded by a Shirk Inside Development grant. The title of the presentation today is, as you can see, what does wellness mean in a pharmaceutical culture? Please welcome Dr. Derkatch.
There's so many people here. I'm so excited. 24 hours after, I tried really hard to get here yesterday. It turns out I'm not actually in control of the fog and the weather, but it was tantalizing us because it would roll in and then go out and roll in, and we kept thinking we'd get out, but we didn't. So I made it today. And I want to begin with a tweet. All good talk should start with a tweet. So the person who came up with wellness as a product adjective is probably living in a castle carved out of gold right now. And so this tweet was tweeted almost exactly a year ago by Nicole Cliff, and she's the editor-in-chief of thetoast.com, which is a wide-ranging feminist website. It's terrific. And really, this tweet captures some of the central issues that I'm investigating in my new book project. And it's really early days. I just got the old one out the door. It's actually not even out yet. It comes out in like a month or less than a month. I'm going to get a copy in a week or so. And so this is a pretty new project. And in this project, I'm really examining how the notion of wellness is mobilized in contemporary public discourse about natural health products or dietary supplements. In Canada, they're regulated as natural health products, but they're more commonly called dietary supplements. So these include herbal remedies, high-dose vitamins, and other plant and animal extracts. So products like echinacea, St. John's wort, ginkgo, cold effects, etc. And so public discussion of supplements is typically undergirded by the notion of wellness. And so this is a term you hear again and again. And wellness is loosely defined, but generally implies the absence or even opposite of illness. And so in the literature about what wellness means to people, usually it emphasizes these four elements. And you'll notice that they each emphasize a positive valence over a negative one. So the wellness model emphasizes health over illness, function over dysfunction, agency over passivity, and overall well-being over mere bodily state. So instead of just being a body that has physiological health, it's about mind, body, spirit, etc. Now the idea of wellness, you might have noticed, I come from Vancouver, so I know this really in Vancouver. I notice it in Toronto as well, but you might have noticed that the word wellness comes up a lot, right? And so we can buy wellness-oriented products like teas and juices. You can buy wellness cereals. You can visit wellness spas and clinics. My friend takes her wiener dog to a wellness vet. We can enroll in workplace wellness programs, and we can visit student wellness centers. And we can protect our protect our wellness by taking supplements. And then we can also track the supplements that we take on our smartphones and iPads and Fitbits and things like that. And we can keep track of other things like our diet, our exercise, our mood, even our sex lives. There are apps where you can rate whether it was good or not good. And so what this tweet suggests, or what this tweet suggests, is that wellness is, among other things, a good sales pitch, right? Wellness really sells. But the research question that I'm approaching my materials with is, how does it work? So if it's a sales pitch, how is the sales pitch working? What is the promise that wellness makes to us? Why does wellness sell? Because it does, as a product adjective. And so as a rhetorician and a language theorist, where I'm always interested in how language moves people towards certain actions and behaviors and away from others, the main question I'm asking here is, what does the language of wellness do for us? And also, what does it do to us? So how are we figured within the language of wellness? And so these are some of the key questions that I'm asking in my study, and I'm looking at a range of sources. And so just to give you a sense of the things I'm looking at, and again, it's early days, but I'm looking at articles about supplements in newspapers and magazines and on websites. So everything from People magazine to the Globe and Mail to Gwyneth Paltrow's website, Goop, if you know about it. And I'm looking at legislative debates about and protests against supplement testing and regulation. And I've conducted 20 interviews with participants in 2 different cities, all of whom identify themselves as interested in wellness and supplements. And I've been asking them about how they think about wellness, how do they enact wellness behaviors, etc. And I'm analyzing the language. So I transcribe these, and I'm looking at a linguistic level. What are the kinds of words and phrasings and ideas that they use and the metaphors that they use to talk about their wellness? Now, it's worth noting, throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to we a lot. And when I'm talking about we, I'm talking about most of us, statistically speaking. So in Western Canada, it's about 60% of the population takes natural products or supplements regularly, about 80% on the West Coast. That's where I'm from. That's what triggered this research. So I'm going to proceed in 3 parts here. It's not going to be a very formal talk. It's going to be just kind of, we'll talk about big ideas and then some specific examples and then how those cash out. So I'm going to look, first of all, at one very specific meaning of the term wellness and how it's used. I'll look at some examples of the language of wellness, and then I'm going to talk about 3 things that I think are driving this discourse. Okay, wellness in the illness model. So when people take supplements, they often frame it in terms of wellness, and this is bolstered by empirical research. When people take supplements, we ask, well, not we, researchers like me ask, why are you taking these products? And they say, well, I want to support my wellness rather than my illness. And they view it as a form of empowerment. It's a way of taking charge of your health, and you'll see this expression come up in a minute. So therefore, wellness is framed positively as maintaining health rather than treating illness. And this kind of opposition between those 2 frameworks is really important, particularly because within this positive frame, supplements are typically framed in binary opposition to pharmaceuticals. And so when we, in the language of supplements, in all of the various different discursive domains I examine, they're often paired up together. So really supplements stand in dialectical relation to pharmaceuticals, and I find that a really interesting tension. So they're typically framed as natural as opposed to chemical or artificial or synthetic. They're perceived as safe rather than dangerous. And I'm talking about perception here. I'm not saying these things are true, but they're perceived as safe rather than dangerous. They're perceived as self-determined as well, rather than prescribed. So you can choose for yourself what to take. You don't need a doctor to prescribe it for you. And they're perceived as protective, so rather than defensive. So they're seen as preempting illness before it can enter the body, rather than treating it once it's already taken root in the body. So there's really positive interpretations here. And so wellness is generally framed as the absence or even opposite of illness. But what I argue in this project is that wellness-oriented behaviors, such as taking supplements, rely on processes, paradoxically, on processes of surveillance and intervention that closely resemble those of the illness model that they seek partially to replace. So if you look at the language people use about supplements, they talk a lot about empowerment, and now I'm saying they, we, but in fact, the terms we think and talk about supplements look a lot like illness discourse. So here's an example. So we're invited to monitor states such as immunity, mood, alertness, and aging, and then treat those things if they fall below a certain perceived threshold, right? So these treatments are anticipatory. So they're not treating actual symptoms of disease. They're seeking to enhance or modify conditions. We could call them regular health conditions, perhaps. And so risk itself in this language becomes a symptom that warrants treatment on its own. So rather than treating disease, we're treating risks of disease. And so here I'm hooking into larger conversations about self-governance and health from Foucault and sociologist Peter Conrad and Ulrich Becht, as well as anthropologist Joseph Dumet. So all of these figures are talking about this in the realm of pharmaceutical medicine, and I'm extending that to look at how does this happen in natural health as well. And so from the perspective of language, what I'm suggesting in this project is that the illness model appears to supply the very terms in which we think and talk about wellness, which is kind of counterintuitive. And so in this valence, the concept of wellness is transformed into a form of incipient illness, or kind of illness in waiting. We're always just kind of at the edge of being ill. So I'm going to give you some examples, because it doesn't mean much without examples. So I'm going to give you just one example, and to explain what I mean when I say that wellness is mapped onto a language of illness, because like I said, it is a bit counterintuitive. And so I'm going to begin with this lady. It's a little bit blurry because it's a screenshot from a low-quality video, but you might recognize her as Suzanne Somers. People over 30 probably remember her from Three's Company. You might remember her as the lady who hawked the Thigh Master in the 80s, that strange-looking device. Now she's kind of a health and wellness guru. She's written, unbelievably, over 17 books. I don't know that she wrote them herself, but she has a website. She's kind of developed a bit of a supplement empire now. But in 2009, she appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And on the show, she walked viewers through her daily regimen for coping with the effects of menopause. And she undertook most of these activities in front of the camera, except one, and you'll know which one it is. Because every morning, she gets up and she rubs a so-called natural estrogen cream on one arm. And I say so-called because at a molecular level, hormones are hormones, and it turns out the natural hormones you buy in a health food store are really chemically the same as ones you would get from a prescription. But so she rubs that into one arm, and then half the month she rubs progesterone cream on the other arm, and then she injects estrogen compounds vaginally with a syringe. That wasn't on camera. And then she finishes up by taking 40 supplements in the morning, and that's the supplements that she takes in the morning. And then at night, she takes another 20. And this is her routine every day. If you do the math, that's over 400 pills a week, right? In addition to that, she regularly tests her own blood and her own urine to maintain optimal hormone levels, right? And she calls all of this natural. She says it's her recipe for healthy aging. She's not sick, she says. This is how she stays well. And so in this particular shot, she's sitting with those pills lined up in front of her, and she explains, you don't have to take all this. Although the deeper you get into it, the more you're apt to want to keep adding to it. And this is a thing I'm so interested in the language of wellness as it pertains to dietary supplements in particular. So for Somers, the practice of supplementation is a little like tugging on a loose thread on an old sweater, right? You pull and then suddenly the whole thing's going up. And it's extreme, yes. But the research suggests that, in fact, it's not as extreme as it might seem, because North Americans take a lot of supplements. So many, in fact, that a team of researchers recently described it as an unrecognized public health problem. And they coined the term polyherbacy, modeled on the term polypharmacy. So polypharmacy, you hear about it a lot. It's when people, often senior citizens, are prescribed multiple possibly interacting drugs, often from different practitioners. Pharmacists sometimes catch these, right, if you get all your prescriptions filled at the same place, but we don't always. And so people take multiple drugs. Sometimes they're contraindicated. So polyherbacy follows on that model. It's when people take natural health products that either conflict with each other or with pharmaceuticals, right? And because people think of supplements as distinct from pharmaceuticals, often people double up. So they'll take St. John's wort and Prozac for depression. Or I think the example I gave this morning was fenugreek and domperidone for breastfeeding, right? So people will double up between a natural product and a pharmaceutical. So even if we don't take 400 supplements a week like Somers, the language that she uses to talk about supplements does help to convey something of the cultural logics that shape the meanings of wellness in contemporary public discourse. So we're going to look at some of those. I've got 3 examples here, and they are all from her book, The Sexy Years. : Discover the Hormone Connection, : The Secret to Fabulous Sex, Great Health, and Vitality for Women and Men. And so, the first is, so these are just 3 really broad strokes characteristics of the language of wellness. There's lots more I could say, but I thought I'd boil it down to 3 things. The first characteristic of this discourse is that natural life states are described in terms of illness. And so, in Somers' case, she describes menopause as an illness requiring medical intervention. And this is really standard fare in the discourse of of menopause. Margaret Locke has written extensively about this, about how menopause is described not as a natural part of aging, but as a kind of biological failure. And so Somers describes menopause as a kind of a crisis. So she says, I was not going to let it beat me. I would not go silently into the night. So I fought for an answer that, So I fought for an answer that would work for me. Right, and you can see here she installs menopause into a very standard metaphoric frame of illness as a battle. Right, we see this a lot in cancer discourse as well. She lost her battle with cancer. He survived, or he's a survivor. We see this a lot, and the medical profession, big nameless, faceless medical profession, increasingly medical professionals are recognizing that this is a problematic metaphor. And so in the UK right now, there's a linguist, Elena Semino, who is actually working with the National Health Service to produce a metaphor manual of things, constructions, it's amazing, constructions that are important for medical providers to avoid. And this battle metaphor is actually one, because it can really cause, we can talk about it later, but it can really cause problems in thinking about how your body works, right? And so the idea here that menopause is something that would like come in and fight against her and try to beat her, right? So that's kind of interesting there. All right. The second thing that she does is frames menopause as a dysfunction, as a condition from which one could even possibly die. I have a little fun, I have to admit, I have a little bit of fun with Somers. She's kind of on the extreme end, but I've analyzed a bunch of other popular sources about menopause, and they're really similar. Oprah's favorite, Christiane Northrup, she's written a bunch. One is The Wisdom of Menopause. Really similar, and she's a physician, so it's not just Somers, but Somers is fun to pick on a bit. So she says at one point, I was no longer making my full complement of hormones. Because of that, I had no life-restoring nutrients feeding me metabolically. My organs were shutting down from lack of nutrients. So when you go through menopause, you're dying, I guess.
Well, yeah, but not immediately.
And not because of, right, and that it's not the cause. And so it's really interesting here because if 50% of the population or so is female, and most females will go through menopause, then you're taking something that's an ordinary life state, and I'm not saying it's not unpleasant, I'm not saying that it's not uncomfortable and worthy of attention, but you're turning it into an illness, right? And framing it as a sign of biological failure. What does that do to the person who experiences it, right? What does that do to their kind of position within the culture? And it's a really problematic framing. And this hooks into the larger conversation about medicalization as well. And I know, Philippa, you've been talking about this, I think, with your students, where medicalization, it's a term from Peter Conrad, when aspects of ordinary living become re-termed and re-described in medical terms and therefore become considered treatable by medical interventions. All right, so that's the first step. And again, I'm just kind of skating over this to give you a bit of a flavor of it. A second dimension of this is that dietary supplements or natural health products are described in terms of pharmaceuticals. So Somers, as with others, they argue for a strong conceptual separation between conventional medicine and supplements. And Somers does this as well. And so she argues that conventional treatments for menopause are a quick fix and that they do more harm than they do help women. And so she, by contrast, she asserts that natural hormone supplements not only alleviate menopausal symptoms, but also give you kind of a health boost at the same time. So they, in her words, they restore vitality, they promote well-being, and they amp up one's sex life. If there's one thing you learn from reading Suzanne Somers' books about menopause, is that she has a lot of sex. She and her husband really do little else, I think, from the books. But the interesting thing is this conceptual separation, and this runs through all the stuff I'm analyzing. I'm analyzing all kinds of different texts, and these separations run through all of them, but those divisions break down quite frequently. And so this conceptual separation between illness and wellness, in that separation, the language of supplements starts to appear indistinguishable from that of conventional pharmaceuticals. And this is what's so interesting because they seem intuitively so differently. So for example, throughout the text, she talks about hormonal changes and hormonal balance. You need to balance your hormones. You go through hormonal changes, and the first term changes is kind of neutral, right? It's kind of just evolutionary. The second one is kind of positive, actually. The idea of the idea of balance is really prevalent in discourse about wellness. It's about achieving balance in your work life and your relationships and spiritually and in your bodily health. So fairly positive term, right? But these two terms are used interchangeably throughout the text. With these terms, hormonal loss or hormonal depletion, hormonal correction, right? It's different to say you're achieving balance than you're correcting your hormones, because that suggests that there is an ideal way that your hormones should be. And so here, menopause becomes a deficiency disease that needs to be fixed, right? And so what's framed in some parts of the text as healthy aging becomes instead unhealthy, and it becomes a sign of bodily failure. So in this framing then, supplements don't supplement or add to health as much as they fix or replace something that is broken. So that's the second characteristic. And third, and finally, empowerment in this discourse involves certain forms of disempowerment. And so I'm going to talk just about empowerment first of all. So all of the texts on wellness I'm analyzing are shot through with questions about, not questions about, but valorizes the idea of empowerment, about taking charge of your health. And so much talk about wellness and supplements. It's not just about restoring yourself to health, but producing a kind of health plus. Carl Elliott calls this being better than well, right? It's not good enough just to be well, but you have to be supercharged, right? You hear words a lot in magazines, you know, the checkout at the grocery store. You hear words like boost, supercharge, packing a punch. I was asked recently by the media to comment on the rise of the word glow, to get a glow. I didn't do it because I don't know what to say. Because it sells, I don't know. But all of these terms you see again and again. And so, one of the things that it does is it sets up the idea of reclaiming agency and authority over your health, right? To protect yourself from forces that are kind of working against you. And you see this happening in Somers' text. So she says, you don't want to lose your energy, lose your sexuality, or be put out to pasture by your family. All the menopausal women are corralled and sent off. But so you don't want to be sent off much the way they do old horses. Your best defense to prevent this from happening is to take charge of your health now.
Or write a really good will or something. I don't know.
So I once actually gave, I don't know if you remember this, Philip, I gave a conference presentation where all I did was analyze that phrase, take charge of your health. That would be part of the bigger project, but it's amazing how often that phrase actually recurs, and then you have to ask, take charge from what? Right? Because that gives you a bit of a sense of the tension that's set up. And as I'll talk about in a minute, I think a lot of this discourse is actually fueled by concerns about the pharmaceutical industry and about the so-called medical industrial complex. I'll get to that, but I'm not there yet. So this is about empowerment, taking charge, right? But then let's go back and think about what Somers just said. You don't have to take all this. Although the deeper you get into it, the more you're apt to want to keep adding to it. And so here, the idea that one might keep adding to the supplement regimen really highlights the blurry line between claiming independence or taking charge of your health and just simply shifting among different forms of dependence, right? And so one of the things I'm finding in my research as I go, and it's actually being more and more confirmed the further I go, is that there is not in the discourse about wellness and natural health a vertical shift in agency from dependence to independence, but it seems to be a lateral shift, actually. So instead of dependence on pharmaceutical medicine and doctors, it's dependence on supplements and magazines, websites, and various other kinds of practitioners. So it seems to be that we're not empowered to go off and just be our own free health subjects and live our lives, but you switch from one kind of pill to another, right? And that's kind of interesting, I find. So those are some specific examples. So now what I want to do is sketch out what, at this stage, again, it's really early days, but what I see as some of the main drivers behind this discourse. So I'm going to talk about 3 key areas that seem to me important. Different valences of the idea of the term wellness and optimization and risk. And so we'll talk first about wellness. And so the concept of wellness itself in my texts reinforces, again, as I said, a conceptual separation between supplements and drugs. So there seems to be a sharp line between those two things. And I think that separation is rooted in part through the rhetoric of supplements themselves. And this is changing, and I can tell you a bit more about that in a second. But they're available without prescription, for example. They're closely associated with nature, and so you typically see leaves or blue or green, naturally colors on packages, right? Or you'd see rainbows or things like that. You also used to, again, it's less true now, but if you wanted to buy natural health products, you often had to go to a natural food store or organic grocery stores with like wood floors and things like that. And they're also advertised, this is really interesting, so they're advertised as addressing the general structure and function of the body rather than specific disease states. And this actually comes from government regulations in Canada and the US, where supplement manufacturers, they're not allowed to make specific disease claims. So they can make claims, very general claims about the structure and function of the body. So a package can say, for example, that it supports menopause, or that it improves cardiovascular health, but it cannot claim reduces hot flashes or lowers cholesterol, right? So it can make really general claims. And those general terms, they sound kind of positive, right? Like, yes, I'm going to support my menopause, and that will make everything go better. But the thing is that supplements, and again, I have taken supplements myself, so I don't exclude myself from the community of people that use them, but they're strikingly similar to pharmaceuticals in ways that I think kind of get glossed over, right? They are synthesized and produced in labs. They're not like packed in capsules on a farm somewhere, right? They're chemicals that produce chemical effects on the body. Physiologically, I'm told the body can't tell when it's processing one chemical from another at that molecular level. They're also, and this is really important, they're produced by for-profit enterprises, and they're promoted by the same marketing techniques. And sometimes you can even track the ownership. If you track it high enough, they're owned by the same parent companies, right? So there's a really interesting book by Dan Hurley called, I think it's called Natural Causes. And he looks at how the natural health industry plays the same games. And in fact, it has the leg up in a lot of ways because that industry does not have the same safety standards. So we can talk about that also. But here's another really interesting thing, and this happens on a cognitive level. It turns out, through empirical research, a pair of researchers named Nichter and Thompson, they did a study, ethnographic study, where they talked to supplement users, and what they found was that supplement users weren't really persuaded by those structure function claims on the packaging. So when it says supports menopause or supports cardiovascular health, it turned out that the people that use those products, they don't really buy into that. They make instant translations in their own minds, and they translate themselves into the disease claim, right? So they're not for a moment taken in by these structure function claims. They know how to read the code and think, supports menopause. Oh, good, I can take that for my hot flashes, right? It's really interesting, and that's happening at the level of the individual consumer. And so one of the things that I find interesting but also a bit concerning as a humanities scholar who, I like to use my research to open up big intractable questions about health and medicine and how can humanities research methods poke at these big questions. One of the concerns I have is that in supplement discourse or discourse about supplements, individuals are groomed not just as agents of wellness, empowered individuals, but also as patients, as medical subjects, and as sites where diseases happen and where treatments take action. And so, but in this case, they may not currently be ill, but they are always inescapably at risk of being ill. And so you see kind of a proliferation of the things we can be afflicted by in this discourse. I'm going to come back to the idea of risk in a moment, but I'll talk about optimization first. All right, so the notion of optimization really encourages active wellness participation, I think, as well as consumerism. So that's kind of the key idea here. So the increased focus on wellness has occurred within the context of a more general and radically consumer-oriented culture of self-improvement, right? Where optimization becomes a moral good. And I'm not thinking just in terms of the body here, but culturally, about doing things faster and smarter and more profitably, more efficiently. And the body and the self become, in this context, a kind of a project that we work on, right? And so many of the participants that I interviewed in my study described wellness as this kind of project that you're always kind of refining and trying to master. And so one of the things that I found so interesting, out of 20 of them, is the majority, like a high majority actually, describe their wellness in quantitative terms or measurable terms in a really interesting way. So here's one example where wellness becomes a kind of math problem where the goal is to reach 100. So that becomes the goal. You want to achieve maximal wellness. This is this new term I've been thinking about, is maximal wellness. So one participant said, wellness encompasses everything: mind, body, soul, spirit. So if one part of you is not functioning well, then your wellness is not 100%. Interesting, right? Another participant, I don't have this on a slide, but she described wellness as kind of a, if you think about it, she called it a gauge, like a gas gauge on a car, right? She said it's really easy to get it to 50%, half full, or even 3/4, right? You can get the needle there. But then it's like the needle moves incrementally slower and it's harder and harder. Or there's like no ceiling and the needle can really go around and around. And so how do you fill up the tank, right? You're always trying to fill up the wellness tank. So for all of my participants who discussed wellness as measurable, any value below 100%, any value below 100%, or the maximum capacity, would require intervention. And so typically the interventions would be taking supplements to help with their digestion, their sleep, their mood, their energy, their immunity. How many of you right now are at maximal energy? How many of you ever are? Or maximal mood, right? They're things that don't really have caps. And that's one of the things, if you have something like diabetes, you take your insulin, you can get your blood sugar level to an ideal range, right? With a lot of, it's not true for all health conditions, of course, certainly. But wellness is interesting because it just pushes that gauge even further. And there really isn't a ceiling there. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I could ever have enough energy. Oh, I've had a lot of coffee today. Should be kind of tiring. That's a couple early mornings in a row. Okay, so what I found most striking then about this quantitative language is that most of the participants admitted quite openly that reaching maximal wellness is virtually impossible. It's an ever-receding goal, right? It's just always slightly out of reach. There's something tantalizing about it. I think about Tantalus a lot in this research, that it always just, it seems on the horizon, but it's like pulling that loose thread on an old sweater, right? You can just keep going. All right. So within this climate of optimization, in this climate where optimization is figured as a moral good, we're compelled to take charge of our health. And that's often through consumer engagement, right? And so we have magazines, and magazines are one of the sources I'm working with, promising to inform readers about the latest fat-busting, mood-boosting, energy-giving, cancer-fighting products available in the health marketplace. I could basically have read, the cover of a magazine there, because you see those words all the time: fat-boosting, toxin-busting, Look for it, because it's all over the place. And so what do these terms do? How do they shape not only how we act as consumers, because they kind of make us want to buy the magazines more, right? But even if you don't buy the magazine, how do those terms and those ways of thinking about our bodies and our health inform the way we think of ourselves as health subjects, right? As we negotiate through our way through the world, how do those ideas about health sit there? Okay. So the ideas of empowerment and agency are really key here. That idea, again, about taking charge of our health to take control for ourselves. And so crucial to this perceived need for control is the notion of risk. And I'm going to just talk about risk by way of conclusion. So the main thing I'm thinking about risk right now is that the idea of risk, the notion of risk, sets us up as always incipiently ill in some way. And so the shift in wellness discourse from empowerment to disempowerment is undergirded, I think, by huge rises in pharmaceutical consumption and the corresponding health anxiety that's created about the drug industry, right? It's no secret now how the drug industry operates and how it really is seeking to maximize pharmaceutical consumption. And so I am about to talk about this, actually. So as Joseph Dumet argues in his recent book, Drugs for Life, he says, the more we know about our health and health risks, the more we fear. And the more we fear, the more preventative actions and medications we need to take. Now, what I was going to interrupt myself with there was just to talk about the title of his book for a second. I don't remember the subtitle. Do you remember the second half of the title?
No.
It's like how the pharmaceutical industry is sometimes. Doesn't matter. The phrase "drugs for life." That actually came from an interview participant so Joe Dumet is an anthropologist, a medical anthropologist, and that came from an interview participant, I believe, who was an executive at a pharmaceutical company, and he was talking about how their goal really is to get people on drugs for life. And he asked this really interesting question near the start of the book, and he says there's all kinds of studies, randomized controlled trials, to tell us when to start a drug. But there's none to tell us when to stop one. That's a big question, right? So the idea of drugs for life is really about getting bodies on drugs. And so, I mean, I don't want to sound paranoid here, but the tricks in the pharmaceutical industry are by now pretty well known. And you can engineer a drug trial to show pretty much anything you want it to. But I want to come back here for a second to this idea of the more we know about risk, the more we fear, the more preventative actions and medications we need to take. Because what he suggests in his book is that pharmaceutical discourse is a kind of self-proliferating discourse, and so too is the discourse of risk. And so there's echoes here of, there's a wonderful rhetorician named Blake Scott, and he talks about risk as well, and he's really drawing on Ulrich Beck's World Risk Society. And he says that the more we try to contain or control risk, the more we often end up increasing it and causing it to spin further out of control. And so he says that the language of risk, the discourse of risk, self-proliferates, right? Discourse about risk begets more discourse about risk. And I think that this is true also in talk about wellness. Discourse about wellness and about supplements really amplifies these concerns in a way that I think we don't fully account for. And so within this framework, risk has become itself a marker of potential disease, and it's one that requires treatment or is framed as requiring treatment. This isn't a bad thing. I'm not trying to say that it's not good to identify risks, but there are known risks of early risk identification, right? So it seems like a good idea to put people on statins, but then there are all kinds of other health effects because of that, right? Same with early breast cancer screening and prostate cancer screening. It seems like a great thing to have early detection, right? But as far as I know, the latest thinking about prostate cancer is most people with prostate cancer will not die of it. Not to say that people don't die of it, but that often the treatments from early detection can cause more harm than letting the cancers go, right? So we have this cultural logic of risk detection and early intervention, and I think it's kind of bleeding out. So now you have people that are taking tons of different supplements because they perceive them as safe and natural, and it's causing problems of its own. So, if efforts to identify risks tend to spiral, which they do, we know that they do, then so, I think, do efforts to treat or reduce those risks. And so the body is formulated in this discursive arena, in the language around risk detection, as always teetering on the edge of failure. Right? So what does that do to the body to set the body up as always on the verge of breakdown? And so within this cultural matrix, individuals faced with the belief that they are at increased risk of illness may, I think, in turn seek ever elusive and ever more qualified notions of wellness, right? Because you can never have enough energy or enough immunity, etc. And so this might be one reason why maximal wellness, or that idea of reaching 100% on the wellness gauge, is always just slightly out of reach, right? And so just to bring things back around, so the goal of my study is therefore to understand how the language of wellness and natural health often does less to empower than it does to reinstall us anew within a framework of illness. And so that's that tension that I'm interested in looking at, where taking charge of our health doesn't always look like taking charge at all. And so if we go back to the tweet I showed you at the beginning, one of the reasons I think that wellness sells then is because our lives seem in some sense to depend on it. And that's all.
Thank you very much, Colleen.
Thank you.
We will not take our vitamins the same way after this talk. We have, of course, time for questions. There's also some drinks and cookies with dietary supplements. Feel free to help yourself. And we have time for 4 questions.
What about, or as an example, vitamin D has been endorsed by the health unit or the and actually that's why a lot of people are encouraged to take it up to what, 2,000 milligrams a day, 1,000 minimum, and up to 2,000 milligrams a day or units a day. So what is your spin on that?
That's a great question. I think it's not to say that all vitamins aren't bad, right? I've had wicked sinusitis for the last month. I am not contagious. And I can tell you a story about that in a second because it reminds me of something I was going to mention during the talk. But the reason why I think about this is I went to see my doctor because I'd had it for a long time, and I know that antibiotics are not the front line recommended, but it had been a while. And so I went to see her, and she's like, well, we'll give it a week, keep taking sinus stuff, and she said take vitamin C as well. But it was interesting the way she said it, because I wasn't sure. I walked out of there going, is she really advising me to take vitamin C? Because she's like, well, the vitamin C will clear out your sinuses. And I was like, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I don't know about that. And then sorry?
Doesn't the C absorb the D?
I don't know. But I wondered if maybe she was saying that just so that I could do something, right? Because she's not giving me a prescription. She seemed very bothered about not giving me a prescription. She was like, I'm really sorry, it's not the recommended treatment. And she seemed to be expecting me to be upset, right? Because people often are upset. They do kind of want to leave with a prescription because then you feel like you've got a real thing, right? And so for that, I think that there's good medical evidence for taking vitamins. I think one of the things that concerns me as, kind of a humanities-based agitator is if vitamin D supplements are being recommended because people aren't getting enough sunlight, then maybe we ought to restructure our lives so we spend more time outside, right? And that's the thing that I find happens a lot in this discourse is it becomes it's a very, I don't want to go into like neoliberalism stuff, but it seems to be that it's a very individualistic, consumer-driven model of approaching health problems when kind of higher level systemic changes could be made that might be more effective, right? So if people are so exhausted all the time that they need to take supplements so they have more energy and sleep better and be less stressed out, then maybe we should rethink how we structure our working lives and our communities, right? That's a big question and it would require maybe a revolution. But at the same time, the onus is placed on individual consumers, and of course it's wealthy consumers for the large part, because the majority of supplement consumers are wealthy and educated and feel kind of that ability to take charge in a way that people are too busy worrying about day-to-day can't. So that would be a part answer, kind of a digressionary response.
The D has been pushed for the last 8 to 10 years, I believe.
Yeah.
And I know that the daily requirement has gone up to 2,000 units a day.
Yeah.
Which is, in my opinion, a lot.
I wonder if it has something to do with how much time or little we do spend outside.
Well, but there's also the question of slathering ourselves with lotion, when we do go outside, so we're not maybe absorbing the vitamin D directly from the sun anymore. So there's that question as well.
Just to add to the vitamin D thing that Carmen said, that it's the media, you're taking it for osteoporosis and bone density, but the doctors don't tell you, they prescribe it, but don't tell you that exercise is the only thing that can increase your bone density. But nobody exercises anymore. It's just a way of our culture.
Yeah. And that's a tough one, right?
It should be told.
That's a tough one, because doctors are hesitant to prescribe lifestyle changes. It's a hard thing
they
to...
can talk all they want, but
it's
got to be put out there like all the drugs are put out there.
And osteoporosis is a really interesting question if you look at that kind of transition between a normal life state, risk, and illness, right? Because osteoporosis itself is, you want to be aware of falls, but the threshold as far as... and especially as you become an increasingly sedentary culture, we're not bearing weight in the same way that we once were, right? And so then that's the thing that kind of sits in the back of my mind is, okay, so then why are we prescribing more stuff when we could be going to gyms or setting up good walking trails? Or those are kind of big philosophical questions. Just to come back to, I hinted at this before, and I'll just mention it quickly because I was talking about the sinusitis. There's been an interesting shift, and I haven't figured this out yet. When I started this project, it was kind of back burner a number of years ago, and supplement packaging was very earthy and green and very natural looking, but it's interesting how it's become pharmaceuticalized in a way where it's often indistinguishable. So when I started this project and then I stopped to finish the book. And so at the beginning, Shoppers Drug Mart and places like that were starting to sell supplements, but they were usually in separate sections, and they were like very green, and it was all marketed differently. But I've noticed that the products have migrated into the pharmacy area now. So the packaging itself actually is starting to become a bit indistinct. And so I went to buy sinus medication, and I saw the usual NyQuil type things. And then there was another brand I'd never heard of, and it looked like all the rest. I was like, what is this? I haven't seen this. And I picked it up, and it had a little tiny leaf in the corner. So I thought, maybe it's herbal, but then I looked, and nothing else on it looked at all. I couldn't tell what it was. I read the instructions. I read the marketing type stuff on the front. Looked like cold medication. It wasn't until I looked for the drug identification number and saw that it was an NPN, a natural product number instead. That's the only way that I knew that that product had no pharmaceutical in it. And when I say pharmaceutical, I mean something that's regulated in a certain category by Health Canada, because natural health products are wildly unregulated. And so that's the only thing telling me as a consumer is knowing to look for that number. And I just found that a really interesting shift that suggests a kind of pharmaceuticalization of wellness.
I'm curious that you just, when you're talking about the fact that these things are migrating into the categories at, say, Shoppers Drug Mart are migrating together. Now, something would be interesting to look at would be what's happening in the stores, because they introduced this wood section. All the supplements were in this section that had wood floors. Yeah. And I wonder if the wood floors are going away.
They are going away.
They are? Okay.
They are, yeah,
okay.
Yeah. The Shoppers Drug Mart, when I lived in Vancouver, the one near me had this like section with wood floors.
Wood floors.
Well, actually, it wasn't even wood. It was like
it was
printed.
It was laminated. It was laminated, but it still wasn't Girato or something like that. And all the bottles had green lids. But
no.
So the stores are changing.
I feel like I saw it coming, and it's happening now, and it's really interesting. So I have a colleague who's a pharmacist, and he's a skeptic, and he has a blog called Science-Based Medicine or Science-Based Pharmacy or something. I can't remember what it's called. He's a very hardline pro-science skeptic. I don't sit quite in his camp. He thinks that anyone that engages with any kind of natural health practice is just totally brainwashed, and he has unkind things to say. But he's a pharmacist, and so he's really taking this on because he's now finding that homeopathic remedies are being shelved next to, and like homeopathy is the one most alternative medicine I'm willing to kind of engage with. Homeopathy is a really, really tough one, because that one I find really exceptionally implausible, because there is, in any homeopathic product, not a single molecule of the product, the substance that the package says is in it, right? Like it's a tough one, but it's getting shelved in pharmacies alongside over-the-counter medications. And now there's a whole side conversation that we won't have time to have about expectation effects or placebo effects, or the idea that just taking something can make you feel better, because that's actually really valid and really important, and I'm not willing to dismiss products like that just on those grounds. But so he's taken it on as this project as a pharmacist, and one of the problems is that collision of interest between commercial enterprise and being a health practitioner, because pharmacies, and it's interesting because pharmacies are often pharmacist owned, but they also have to sell stuff. Right, and those sell well. People want them. People really want them. And so then, how do you balance those two different needs?
I was just wondering if you noticed any difference in the discourse in discussing typically female situations and male situations. Is the same language more or less? Is it possible to distinguish between wellness for females and wellness for males?
That's a great question. I haven't attended to it specifically because most of the stuff I've encountered is about women and for women. Women are, by large, the biggest health consumers, wellness consumers, pharmaceutical consumers, natural health product consumers, right? And there's all kinds of interesting and complex reasons why. None of them have to do really with the fact that women's bodies are worse, I don't think. So I haven't noticed exactly, because I tend to be looking at stuff in women's magazines. That's something certainly to look at. I did have a graduate student in my seminar last semester he was a kind of a bodybuilder type, and so he went to GNC and he looked at some of their marketing. Actually, a couple of them did. He looked at muscle building supplements, and then another analyzed packaging for erectile products, and they both noticed how hyper masculine the packaging is. Like, really, it's about and you don't see leaves and flags. So they found. Do you know what's interesting is they found a lot of, the one student found a lot of arrows pointing up. Anyway, so yes, I think that's something I will be looking at. I just haven't yet, because I tend to be looking at.
Can't wait to read the book.
I'm on menopause right now. Menopause is the main thing. Do you have time for that?
So there's I guess becoming a lot more popular around here is traditional Chinese medicine and Eastern medicines. Have you noticed in the translation to the westernized market if there's a difference between those products and the traditional, more Western products?
That's a great question. I haven't looked at the products so much, but I've looked at practices, particularly acupuncture, and that's really interesting. So my book that's about to come out, I don't have it on a slide or anything, but my book that's just about to come out, I looked at that in a lot of detail, and one of the things that happens with acupuncture is that all the traditional, and I think this is probably true of Chinese herbs as well, is that the traditional Chinese explanations of the mechanism of effect, or what makes it work, are peeled off. So the traditional Chinese meridian theory, the idea of energy flow through channels and the balance of elements, gets peeled off, and so you get physiotherapists who will do acupuncture, but none of the meridian theory is invoked, even though they're trained in acupuncture, but they're trained through medical acupuncture, and so you do see that there. So it's a very kind of westernized practice, and when researchers and practitioners try to explain the effect, they usually talk in very physiological terms about, the release of endorphins and things like that as the reason why it works, not because your energy levels have been opened. Or so that's a kind of a half answer. I haven't noticed with herbs as much. I'm really focusing on right now on very mainstream like pharmacy, health food kinds of herbs.
There was one.
Hey. Hi.
I know you're focusing on menopause mostly, but have you seen...
It's actually just one small part of the project. I'm just in that moment.
Okay. Have you focused on maybe the discourse around pregnancy and whether or not there's similar frames that are being applied?
I have not myself, but that's just because colleagues of mine have, and there's a couple really great books. One is The Rhetoric of Pregnancy, which is I really recommend it. So I haven't so much myself. No, it's an interesting and great question, especially the way pregnancy gets medicalized, and the pregnant body is surveilled. But not for this. I haven't. It's a great question.
Norman?
Yeah, I have a really basic question.
Yeah.
The word wellness.
Yeah.
I'm sort of a grumpy old curmudgeon, so my first reaction whenever I hear that word is I want to reach for my gun and shoot somebody. I first became aware of that word coming into discourse around the early to mid-90s, and it just occurred to me, I don't think I'd ever seen it so clearly, as when you pointed out that it's actually directly related to illness. It's almost couched for illness. So why did it come into effect? Is that
That's a really great question.
How did it come into use?
That's a great question. I don't know the full history of it. I know I was actually looking at the OED definition the other day, and that is the official OED definition, is that it's the absence of illness. Why it rose in the 90s, I think it was a convergence of a bunch of things. There's a really great book called Better Than Well. Something medicine, American medicine meets the American dream or something, and it talks about the collision between American medicine and that sort of grand idea of the good life. And so he talks about some of those ideas about optimization I was talking about before, and I think one of the ways into it is the rise of workplace wellness programs, because those are really interesting because they're usually not actually about the health or wellness of the worker. It's usually about minimizing absenteeism and increasing productivity. I don't have an answer to your question. I will by the time I write the thing, but that's it's a good question. But it rose up. I think a convergence of a variety of things. I mean, that's when the pharmaceutical industry really took off in its marketing techniques, right? With the first new blockbuster drugs like Prozac. That was all kind of coalescing at the same time, and I think part of where wellness emerged was resistance against that model, even if it's informed by the same terms of that model.
I can remember hearing someone told me once that, oh, health has negative connotations. In other words, the word health automatically means bad health, right? Or you're healthy, which I thought, no, it didn't seem that way to me. I mean, you can also say, I can't imagine toasting anyone to saying, to your wellness.
And that's interesting. So
it's
health,
a very old word that can have positive connotations or neutral connotations or bad connotations, but why? It didn't seem like an explanation to me. And there's got to be something. It seems to me that it's basically just some kind of gimmick that somebody invented.
I mean,
and
it's
like
a
excellence in universities.
Yeah. Well, synergy now, and I think a couple. So one of the questions I asked my interview participants, and I'm sorry I'm not able to recall what they said at this moment, but one of the things I asked them is how would you compare, how do you define wellness, how do you understand wellness, but then how do you compare wellness to illness, and then how do you compare wellness to health? And that was a really interesting question because they pretty universally described health in terms of bodily health, physiological health, right? At a molecular, cellular level, the body is healthy, where wellness, that bodily health was just part of a multidimensional approach.
So it's the new age thing.
I think it's
new
really,
age supplement.
I think it's the kind of glossy, commercialized version of like 60s and 70s
New age discourse.
New agey hippie-ness. I think in packaged up in like really easy to sell form, and I think that's. I mean, there's something that feels really good about talking about wellness, right? Like you feel like you're being a good person. I'm with you. I have to say, I'm kind of, I'm cranky too.
Sorry, I see that label and I just want to go, no, I won't buy that. No way.
Sorry, Mama, you are abnormal.
I just wanted to add to, it's because I did a research for an undergrad thesis I'm a massage therapist, so I was interested in finding out what is perceived as the right amount of discomfort during a massage. Okay. Because that too, right? Yeah. You're going in for wellness, because that's usually what brings people in. So I started my interviews. I did 20 interviews, so with therapists and then with massage clients. Okay. And I explored the healthy and the wellness. And I came up with the same thing as you did, where healthy was more about the body, while wellness was like they would often refer to body, mind, balance, work, life, all that kind of thing was more wellness, and that's usually what brought them to massage therapy.
So interesting.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, that word balance, right? Because it slips so quickly, because balance sounds so good and achievable and things are running in sync, but then
and it was often
hard to maintain. And then are you bad if you don't keep that balance? Like how do you?
And it's being proactive. They're always, resisting illness or resisting injuries. People are like, there was a few that were nurses, so it was making sure that they could function, they could move. So, yeah. I felt like a lot of your research. I can't wait for your book to come out because I want to buy it. And what's the publishing?
Oh, it's off in the future.
Oh, it's off in the future.
I can give you my card if you want it. Yeah, I've published one little thing that is already out. But,
okay.
But yeah, we can talk and stay in touch because I want to hear more about your work too. That's fascinating.
I'm still working on it. But I love like, you know, the words, the discourse. Laura Mosley was talking about dangers. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
He does a lot on pain.
Okay.
And it's about dangers in me and perceived dangers and safety. DIMS and SIMS.
Can I get that from you after? Because that's one of the things that happens is, I think, in this discourse, the body becomes an object of suspicion that I think that we don't fully recognize where, and there's this really interesting thing that happens at a linguistic level where there's a separation between kind of the person and the body, so part of my project involves looking at cleanses. And cleanses, usually they're supported by supplements. You take a lot of them, and then you don't eat a lot, and then stuff comes out of you. And so there's a whole world of poop on the internet where people show pictures of their poop and talk about how it looks, what it should. But the interesting thing about it is how the body is figured in these discussions, because people will be like, "Can you believe this is what came out of me?" Where the body had been like harboring these kind of concealed toxins and illnesses or potential illnesses, and that they were able to expel these from their kind of naughty, deceptive body. And so it actually figures the body in a way that I think, you know, merits attention.
And actually that's funny because even with massage, right, it's, you know, they're finding those knots, they're getting them out, they're, you know what I mean, like that's all working on the body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
This is the last one. You mentioned antibiotics. What's your view on probiotics as a preventative measure for that?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think that, when I think about probiotics, I think that they sell really well. I don't know whether and how they work. I think that, yeah, I don't know is what my answer is. I'm just trying to remember, I taught an article in my seminar last year about advertising about probiotics on websites, and I'm trying to remember what the central argument was there. I think it's that blurry line that I don't think these things are problems. I think they're just things we want to be alert to, because I think at the end of the day, what I want to really probe is how much of our everyday lives are informed by what I would call pharmaceutical subjectivity, so that we think of food now in terms not of the pleasure it gives us or what we, you know, the pleasure gives us how good it tastes, the experience of cooking and eating a meal together, and it becomes fats, and it becomes antioxidants, and it becomes probiotics and things like that, so that food becomes a kind of another kind of a pharmaceutical that we can take. And if we want to live our lives that way, okay, but I think we're losing sight of other ways that we could experience our bodies. And so I think that's all I could really say right now. I haven't gotten into probiotics yet, but there is a whole body of literature about the nutraceutical movement and functional foods. Some good anthropologists and sociologists are working on that. So that's a deflective answer, but
thank you.
Question, if there is no other question.
Okay.
I would like to know about the means of resistance that you are perhaps exploring, studying, or suggesting. We can think of changing our habit, exercise, food. Certainly in your work there is the idea of an awareness of all these discourses. And perhaps also the creation of a counter-discourse to fight against this discourse. And I was thinking also of the distinction made by Foucault to refer between the riscophobe and riscophile. So riscophobia and riscophilia. And this has to do with the section. And so the friend of risk and the person who is afraid of the risk. So we certainly live in in a risk society, as you mentioned, I mean, riskophobic society. But then what would be this riskophilia? If there is, I don't know, bungee jumping to
that's interesting. I think I mean, the problem with the work that I do is I always end up saying, well, I guess we just need a revolution, right? Like, and then you just throw up your hands. But I think that we talked, when I visited Philippa's class this morning, we talked about little acts of resistance. There's a wonderful book called Against Health, How Health Became the New Morality, where the different essays in there sort of sing the praises in a way of things like smoking and obesity and other things like that. They're not really saying they're good, but they're saying that, you know, having a bag of Doritos at the end of the day might not be a sign that somebody doesn't like their life and doesn't want to take care of themselves, but actually is a sign of their attachment to life, because they're carving out a space for pleasure at the end of a hard day, and that we don't want to lose sight of that. So I don't know what the solution is. I think that the humanities is maybe not always, the humanities is really good at opening up questions, and so one of the things I think, in just asking the questions, I think you're kind of putting an idea out there. If you want to think, how would you address some of this? I mean, my kind of personal sort of mission, I guess, is try to get people to take fewer pills of all kinds. How do you do that? Well, you give talks like this. You know, I always say when I have more time, but writing like op-eds, magazine articles, things like that, just to bring awareness to these kinds of questions and think like, well, do you really need to take all of that stuff? Or maybe we could rethink how we approach life problems. But I think that I think the one thing that this kind of research is good at is asking questions that, to borrow a phrasing from, she was actually my PhD supervisor, Judy Siegel, and she said that the humanities are really good at opening up intractable questions in health and medicine that are not really answerable through medical research. So one of the things that a humanities scholar can do is ask questions that are conceptually prior to the questions that could be asked by medical researchers. So her example is, instead of asking how to make plastic surgery safer, a humanities researcher might ask, how are people persuaded to consider themselves candidates for surgery to begin with? And so one of my questions is instead of making supplements safer and more accessible, how are people persuaded that those are interventions that they want to engage with, and what are they trying to express through those interventions, and could they try to maybe express those in other ways? I think really we just have to have a revolution. Dramatic.
In the name of the Humanity program, we would like to offer you this little gift.
Thank you.
Which is a vase made by artists from the region here.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
Put your supplements in it.
Okay. So it goes to look. Oh, it's beautiful. Oh, wow. That is gorgeous. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And I'm so happy that so many of you were here. It's really, yeah.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Okay, there's still some supplements.
Unhealthiness too. This is lovely, thank you.
Yeah, it's made by and I really like it. There was only one like this.
I love the matte and glossy. It's actually really fun.
Yeah.